Statement of Inquiry. The Navajo Code was an unbreakable language used in World War II to the Americans' advantage against the Axis powers after they were drawn into global war. The code was used to communicate to the U.S. Navy and was unbreakable because it was a traditional Navajo identity trait. A sense of nationalism was brought forward to the Navajo community through the cultural communication throughout the war. In World War II, America was drawn in a global war against the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan. But no one knew what was up their sleeve: the Navajo Code Talkers. What is code? The universal definition of code is a system of words, letters, figures, and other symbols substituted for other words, letters, and so on, especially for the purpose of secrecy. Many things are written in code, such as secret messages, computer codes, commands, and more. Post-World War II, the U.S. Army was using Cherokee for code, but were eventually broken. Enigma, Sigaba, Type X were all different codes that were used in World War II, but the one that stands out is the Navajo Code Talkers. In World War II, the U.S. Army thought of using indigenous American languages, so they developed the Cherokee Code Talker Unit. The code was broken, but then they found the Navajo language, a language that was never written and was impossible for anyone to speak unless you were part of the Navajo tribe. The language never had any terms for advanced warfare, so they had to develop their own dictionary with codes for different scenarios. The dictionary was composed of 411 terms and had words for submarines, planes, and so on. What is communication? Communication is something that people do every day, including yourself. The universal definition is the imparting or exchanging of information or news. An example of communication might be asking someone how their day is or calling someone up. But during World War II, instead of phones, there were radios. The Navajo Code Talkers communicated their codes through radios as they were paired up, one person sending and relaying messages and the other operating the radio. How did the Code Talkers become a thing? Philip Johnson knew that the Navajo language was never written, and the Americans were failing using Comanches, Choctaws, Hokies, Cherokees, among other Native American languages. In 1940 Oklahoma, the U.S. military trained a class of 29 Code Talkers. In May of 1942, the class was ready to communicate secret codes. During the time they were training, they made a dictionary. I mentioned it earlier. The dictionary contained two types of codes since the Navajo language had no military terms. The first type was named Type 1 and consisted of 26 Navajo terms that represented English letters. When translating the word for code, for example, they would take each letter and use a word for it. For the word code, the C would be cat, the O would be owl, the D would be dog, and the E would be elk. The full term would be Type 2 contained words directly translated from English to Navajo. For example, there was no word for submarine, so they translated it to iron fish. Beshla was the Navajo term. A patrol plane would be called, meaning crow in English. A minesweeper would be called, meaning beaver in English. The Navajo language was also a tonal language, making it that much harder to break. The code was so secret that the Japanese captured a Navajo that was not part of the Code Talker unit. The Japanese tortured him in order for him to break codes, but he didn't know what any of them meant since they had their own system. Of course, the Japanese didn't like the "I don't know" answer the civilian was giving him, so they beat him up and he was later rescued. The Navajo Code Talkers participated in the Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Pului, and Iwo Jima War. It was a hard job for the Code Talkers, since the Japanese targeted officers, medics, and radio men. During the battle at Iwo Jima, the Code Talkers were able to transmit over 800 messages without fail. 5th Marine Division Signal Officer Major Howard Connor said, "The entire operation was directed by the Navajo Code. During the 2 days that followed the initial landings, I had 6 Navajo radio nets working around the clock. They sent and received over 800 messages without error. Were it not for the Navajo Code Talkers, the Marines never would have taken Iwo Jima." Long-term effect. One of the long-term effects is that the Navajo Code Talkers are still with us today, is they helped win the war against Japan, and they created an unbreakable code with the ancient language of their people that no one could break, that helped them win many wars against their enemies. The code was a next step in communication and proved effective in war. Today, the Code Talkers that still represent their impact on winning of World War II and stand for the natives of America. Conclusion. Code was not only the main, but most effective form of communication during war. The Code Talkers defied speed and efficiency under the amount of pressure that they went through while communicating. They made an unbreakable code that had the most secrecy, even those who spoke the language didn't even know what they were talking about. Thanks for watching. Thesis. In 1942, the Navajo Code Talkers created a communication system that allowed for the Navajo to transmit over 800 messages during Iwo Jima. The Code Talkers improved the speed of encryption and decryption of communications in the frontline operations during World War II.